So today we celebrate the Feast of Christ the King, or the Reign of Christ. It's always the last Sunday of the liturgical year before we move into Advent, which is the beginning of the liturgical year next Sunday. And it was started by Pope Pius XI in 1925. And the reason he was doing it is that the then King of Italy, the last King of Italy, was agitating to take political control of Vatican City. As you know, Vatican City is its own little fiefdom in the midst of Italy and Rome. And there were also multiple military uprisings and political uprisings happening throughout Christendom. Mexico, Germany, the beginnings of fascism were happening in Germany, as well as the political revolution that would eventually get rid of that king and that monarchy. And what this Pope wanted Christianity to hear was that the only kingdom that really matters is the kingdom of God, and the king of that kingdom, Jesus, known as the King of Kings or the Lord of Lords. And that any political upheavals that were happening in people's lives, and it was happening in a number of Catholic countries, were to be taken to be endured with patience, as we heard in the letter to Colossians today, and that people should not fear, because that ultimately God would overrule any rulers of the world, and that the citizenship that mattered most to Christians would be the citizenship in heaven. So it was sort of a way of saying, have no fear, but ironically also a way of saying, and don't let them take over Vatican City, right? And they won that battle. So the readings that are associated with this all have to do with the power of God and, interestingly, the power of Jesus, the interesting way that Jesus wields power in the world. Now, the Old Testament readings you hear sort of promise a God who's going to overthrow the lousy rulers of the world and bring in God's own shepherds who will do a much better job of leading the world. But all the commentaries you read about these readings, like the reading from Jeremiah as well as Psalm 46, a mighty fortress is our God. Well, what everybody who reads that psalm or that passage has to realize, that what we already know, which is that God does not take care of every worldly problem. God does not resolve every revolution the way we want it. God has not stopped climate change. God does not end all plagues as quickly as we would like. So God may be working through or around the powers of the world or the dangers of the world, but not necessarily preventing all the difficult things from happening to us. And so as a result, we need to understand the power of God a little bit differently. Well, enter Jesus, because the entire ministry of Jesus was proclaiming a very different kind of power and a very different kind of kingdom. The leaders of the world were trying to gain control from themselves and kick out whatever political power was in power, or taking over land that used to be theirs. That's why people fight wars. But Jesus was doing something very different. From the very beginning, he was self-sacrificial. So self-sacrificial that he gave up his own life in order to usher everybody else into his kingdom. We hear about royal families in Europe now saying, we're going to remove the number of people who are officially royal because it's getting too expensive and it's too threatening to the rest of the country to have too many princes and princesses. Well, Jesus did the opposite. He said, everybody can enter my kingdom of heaven. He said it to the poor thief on the cross who was a convicted felon. He said, you will be with me today in paradise. I will let everybody in, and you have an equal inheritance. You inherit what I inherit. We are all princes and princesses in the kingdom of God. So he was inviting. He was equalizing, taking the poor and making them rich, taking the outcast and making them favored. That was what his ministry was all about. He also empowered regular, fallible human people to be his leaders, knowing, as the writers of the Old Testament knew, that we human beings always blow it from time to time as leaders, whether we're leaders of our families or churches or our naval commands or whatever. We always blow it at some point as leaders. And yet, he took perfectly fallible human beings and said, whatever I can do, you can do, and even greater. That's him in the Gospel of John. That's astounding. Most leaders, Powerful leaders say that they have a greatness that the rest of us don't have, and we need to stay in our place. They're not trying to lift us up to be equal with them, but that's exactly what Jesus was saying. He was saying, be equal to me, and even though you will fail, keep striving to be equal with me. He was a collaborative leader. He taught us to be collaborative leaders. He said, go in pairs, go in groups of 12, go in groups of 144. He always sent people off together to lead in groups, knowing that we would be less likely to fall down as leaders if we were making decisions collaboratively. Thus, we have vestries and conventions in our church because we were taught as Christians to lead in a collaborative manner. In that sense, he's become a perfect example to us of the kind of leader God would want us to be if we could lead as well as Jesus. So in order to explore this, I'm going to show you an example of poor leadership that I think you'll enjoy, and then we can examine where that leader went wrong. When I was a young single mother, my daughter was almost 3 years old. I asked my dad over to babysit. My dad was a wonderful dad, kind, firm, the limits were clear. He was fun when he took care of us when I was a kid. So I thought he'd do a great job babysitting. I was going out for the evening, and we had a little bit of leftover chocolate birthday cake and some Coca-Cola in the refrigerator. And my daughter was young and sensitive to caffeine, so I said, Dad, I need her to go to bed at 8 o'clock, I need her to sleep well. So I said, no chocolate cake and no Coke. And he said, got it. I come home at 11 p.m. Have you seen a child on caffeine and sugar? Yes. My daughter was jumping up and down on the sofa, and she leapt from the sofa to the armchair, bounced there, and then leapt towards the front door, ran up to me, and said, Mommy, Mommy, Nunu gave me chocolate and Coke, and he told me not to tell you. Thanks, Dad. Now, here's how my dad failed as a Christian leader. First of all, he wasn't collaborative. We had an agreement as fellow leaders of this child that she wasn't going to get any caffeine so that she could get sleep and thus I could get sleep, right? That kid didn't get to sleep until 1 o'clock in the morning. So he was also dishonest. So you'll notice that poor liars like to lie, and they like to make other people lie. So my dad not only was going to lie to me, he said to her, don't tell your mother. He tried to turn my daughter into a liar. Well, she thought that was so funny that she told me. That's how I found out. He didn't buy into our shared mission, which was to have a well-rested child and thus a well-rested mother. So he fell down in multiple ways as a Christian leader. But I read an example in the newspaper a few weeks ago, and I saved it saying, I need to put this in a sermon someday. I don't know how many of you heard about the CEO and his wife, Yvon Chouinard and Melinda Chouinard of the Patagonia company. Do some of you know what Patagonia is? It's a well-known company that makes rather high-priced outdoor gear that lasts a long time, outdoors and climbing gear. And when he was a young man, he would go hiking in Yosemite Valley and live out of a car and eat, I'm not kidding, dented cans of cat food. For a nickel a can. He was a very poor man, and somehow he and his wife and their 2 children turned it into a business of $120 billion a year. He was valued at $120 billion per year, and he was put on the cover of Forbes, and he was upset about it. Not upset that people knew he was rich, he was upset that he is rich, that he found it appalling that he had so much money when other people had so little. Now, if you know about their products, you know that they try to make things out of recycled materials, and they also will repair any item of clothing. So if you rip your jacket, you could send it to them, and they'll repair it because they don't want you to keep buying more stuff and throwing old clothes away. Black Friday's coming up. I'm sure you're aware of it. I'm sure you're getting 10,000 emails about what you should be buying this weekend. And they put out a Black Friday ad for a jacket of theirs in the 1980s, and the ad said, don't buy this jacket. They actually didn't want you to go shopping on the Thanksgiving weekend, to buy it, to pay for the shipping, the packing, and then what do you do with all the packing materials? He didn't want people to do that. So that has always been his ethic. They've always been leaders. They've provided free childcare for their employees. and led in other environmentally safe ways. Well, they're now 83, he and his wife, and he was trying to figure out a way to give it all his money away, but to make sure that Patagonia didn't turn into just another company that was generating more waste in the world. He wanted to protect wildlands, and he wanted to further do anything to help reduce climate change. So it took lawyers months to figure out how to solve this problem. They gave the ownership of Patagonia and all of its profits to an outside foundation which they formed, and all of the profits, which are usually $100 million a year, are going to be to preserve wildlands and to fund advocacy for climate change initiatives. In other words, to improve our environment, to save the planet. He said basically to fund the saving of the planet. They're not going to benefit in any way. He said, we own a house, we're fine. Their children still work for the company, and their children said, do not give the billions to us, give it to other people. And he's doing it because he wants to remove the extreme differences between the billionaires of the world and the very poorest of the world, who are losing out the most when coastlands and farmlands go away due to climate change. He's trying to upend that. And he's not the only one. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, who is roundly, castigated all the time for being a gazillionaire. I don't know how many billions he has. He's doing it on his own, but he gave $10 billion last year to plant green carbon sinks throughout the world, to reforest the world, to plant more green things to absorb the carbon from the world, and is doing also funding things that will help save the planet. When I looked at what the Chouinards were doing, I know I'm sorry if you're listening, can't say the name very well, but when I looked at what they're doing, I said, how Christian? And I don't know if they're actually are Christian. They gave away their entire company and all the riches. They're comfortable, don't get me wrong, they're comfortable. They've given away the $120 billion completely. And the lawyers who did this said they not only did it, but they did it in such a way that they didn't shelter themselves from any taxes. So they paid a bunch of taxes as well, because they didn't want to shelter themselves from taxes. And their children also said, we don't want to have it either. We want to spread the benefit that we never meant to have. They didn't mean to be billionaires. We want to spread it to the rest of the world. It's self-sacrificial. It's collaborative. They've now spread this work of doing this, saving the planet, to a bunch of people. They're going to fund a bunch of advocates that they're going to work with. They're spreading it to people like me, because I think, okay, I'm not going to answer any of those Black Friday ads, because this man is saying, don't buy the jacket. I've got a jacket already. I don't need another Patagonia jacket. So all those Patagonia emails I'm getting will just be ignored. Do you see how he's spreading it? He's trying to equalize it and spreading it just in the same way Jesus did, and inviting other people into it. Now, I know you might think, I was sitting there thinking, well, I don't have billions, and I didn't have such a brilliant idea, and I'm just a regular old person. But in fact, even our smallest efforts, our smallest gifts are useful to God and the kingdom. All that convict on the cross had was a moment of faith. That's all he had. That's all he had to give, was to say to Jesus, you don't deserve to be here. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. And that was a gift that Jesus accepted, a gift of faith. We give in many ways. We volunteer a lot, right? And you'll see in the newsletter we sent out on Thursday, invitations if you want to find a new way to volunteer, or if you haven't volunteered at all. We've listed a bunch of ways for you to volunteer. You certainly can keep giving money to the church. We love it. It helps us do our ministry. And if you haven't pledged yet, there are pledge cards for you in the pew. We are $28,000 away from having a balanced budget. We are very close, people, and getting closer by the day. So there are a few more pledges that we're waiting for, and you can increase the pledge you've already given us if you want. We would love that. You can give to causes in the community, and I know many of you already do that. But probably the greatest thing we can do is to show that faith that the convict had on the cross, that when there is political turmoil in the world, when there is turmoil about the events of the world, Yes, we have to pay attention to it. Yes, we have to advocate for change, but we also hold on to that endurance and patience and love of our neighbor that is so unique in the world right now. The more we can do that as faithful people, as the world feels turbulent, the more we will be a sign of that kingdom of Christ that is all around us, that people so rarely see, except now and then, like when the Chouinards give away their whole company. Amen.